History often remembers Alexander as Philip's son, the heir to Macedonia, the prince destined to inherit the strongest kingdom in Greece. But that only tells half the story, because Alexander was only half Macedonian. His father spent most of his life on campaign, was capturing cities, crushing rivals, building an empire. Philip was rarely home as a result of that. And while the king was out making the family fortune, Alexander was growing up somewhere else. He was growing up with his mother and with her people, the Molossians. To the Greeks and Macedonians, the Molossians had a reputation all their own. This was a wild reputation. They lived beyond the familiar Greek world, in the rugged lands west of Macedonia, near what is now Albania. Ancient writers described them almost like frontier people. They were hard, dangerous, exotic, and according to tradition, they claimed descent from Achilles himself. Most Macedonian nobles cared only about the father's bloodline. That's what mattered. That's where legitimacy came from. Yet Alexander was unusual. Again and again throughout his life, he emphasized his mother's ancestry, his connection to Achilles, his connection to the Molossians. It was an identity he never abandoned. And at the center of that world stood Olympias. Few women in ancient history inspire such radically different descriptions. Some writers portray her as brilliant, others as terrifying, others as both. She appears surrounded by stories of snakes, mystery cults, religious ceremonies, prophecies. Now, whether these stories are true ultimately hardly matters because they reveal how people remembered her, not as a queen, but as a force. The kind of person who changes every room she enters. The kind of person nobody ignores and nobody forgets. And if the ancient sources are even partially correct, she was absolutely ruthless. Because Alexander had a rival, a half-brother named Aridaeus. In most royal families, Aridaeus would have represented a serious threat. Another son, another possible heir, another candidate for the throne. Yet somehow, he never became one. Something happened to Aridaeus, some kind of mental instability, something that removed him from contention. Ancient writers blamed Olympias for this. Plutarch claims she used potions, drugs, poisons, something that ultimately damaged his mind. Is it true? No one knows. But what makes this accusation fascinating is that it sounds exactly like something later on Olympias might do. Because years later, she would kill Aridaeus, she would kill his wife, and she would do it without hesitation. Whether the stories are true or not, one thing becomes clear. Olympias believed Alexander's future was worth protecting at any cost. And for better or worse, that was the environment in which Alexander grew up. A father building an empire, a mother fighting for a throne, a household where power was never theoretical, and where weakness could be fatal. The future conqueror was still a child, but already the forces shaping him were extraordinary. If Olympias shaped Alexander's imagination, others would shape everything else. Because believing you are destined for greatness is one thing, being capable of achieving it is another. Philip understood that. Macedonia was not a kingdom where soft men survived. Its kings fought in battle. Its nobles expected danger. Its soldiers followed leaders who bled beside them. A future king could not simply inherit authority. He had to earn it. And so Alexander's education began in a way that seems almost shocking by today's standards. Not with philosophy, not with literature, not with kingship, but with hardship. Olympias selected one of his earliest tutors from her homeland, a Molossian, a hard man from a hard country. The sources paint him less as a teacher and more as a drill sergeant, the sort of man who believed comfort was a weakness, the sort of man who believed character was forged through suffering. And Alexander became his project. Imagine, if you will, the future king of Macedonia, a young prince surrounded by wealth, servants, luxury, every privilege imaginable. Now imagine someone deliberately taking those privileges away, searching his belongings, confiscating treats hidden by his mother, denying comforts, forcing long marches, keeping him awake, driving him forward long after exhaustion had set in. The message was clear. One day, Alexander would command Macedonian veterans, men who had followed Philip through years of warfare, men who carried scars, who had watched friends die, men who respected strength and very little else. These men would never follow a pampered prince, so the pampering ended. Years later, ancient writers, they would describe Alexander as remarkably fast, relentless, always moving, always restless. Some even credited his early training, the habit of marching, the habit of enduring, the habit of pushing through discomfort. Whether this is true or not, the lesson ultimately remained. The future conqueror learned that early kingship was not comfort, kingship was endurance. And after his body came his mind. Another tutor entered Alexander's life. This was a very different figure to his initial tutor. He was less interested in hardship, he was more interested in discipline. The sources describe him as a very austere gentleman, reserved, the kind of teacher concerned more with self-control, with dignity, with the behavior expected of rulers. One story survives from this period. It's a small story, but it's the sort of stories that historians love because it reveals character, or at least what later generations believe about character. Alexander finds himself standing before an altar. A sacrifice is being offered. Incense was thrown into the sacred fire. The incense was expensive, very expensive. Now, most children would have used a small amount, just enough to participate or enough to satisfy tradition. Alexander grabbed 2 enormous handfuls of this and cast them into the fire. The gesture must have looked impressive, generous, almost kingly. His teacher was not impressed. The man immediately rebuked him. That incense costs money. When you're the one earning it, then you can throw as much as you like. Until then, show some restraint. It was a simple lesson, but simple lessons often survive because they matter the most. Powerful people frequently confuse access with ownership. They assume abundance removes responsibility. The tutor was trying to teach the opposite: self-control, discipline, moderation. Qualities Alexander would possess, at least some of the time. Years later, after conquering much of the known world, Alexander reportedly remembered the incident. And like so many stories involving Alexander, there is a perfect ending. He sent vast quantities of incense back to his former teacher, caravans loaded with the expensive substance, along with a message: do not be stingy with the gods. It's impossible ultimately to know whether this exchange happened exactly that way, but it sounds like something Alexander would do. Part gratitude, part triumph, part joke, part challenge. A reminder that the boy once scolded for wasting incense had gone on to acquire more wealth than anyone could have imagined. Yet even those teachers would soon be overshadowed, because Philip had bigger ambitions for his son. Hardship could build character, discipline could build self-control, but neither could prepare Alexander for the future Philip imagined. For that, he needed something rarer: knowledge. And so Philip, he turned to one of the greatest minds in the Greek world at the time. This is a man whose name would outlive kingdoms. His ideas would survive empires. The man's name? Aristotle. And with his arrival, Alexander's education would become something far more dangerous. Not simply the education of a prince, the education of a man who might one day change the world. There are moments in history when 2 extraordinary people cross paths. Moments that seem almost impossible in hindsight. A brilliant student, a brilliant teacher. A future conqueror, a future philosopher. And for a brief period in the 4th century BC, those 2 people sat in the same classroom. Alexander's new tutor was Aristotle. Even today, his name carries enormous weight. Philosopher, scientist, scholar, teacher. A man whose influence would survive the fall of kingdoms, the collapse of empires, and the passing of more than 2,000 years. When Philip hired him, Aristotle was not yet the legend we remember today. He was simply one of the most respected individuals in the Greek world, and Philip wanted him for his son. The arrangement benefited both men. Philip gained the greatest teacher available. Aristotle gained something equally valuable: patronage, resources, and ultimately protection. The king even agreed to rebuild Aristotle's hometown, a city previously destroyed during Macedonian campaigns. It was a remarkable agreement. It revealed something very important about Philip. The king was not merely building an army. He was looking to build a dynasty. Military strength could win you territory, but Philip wanted something larger. He wanted permanence, and permanence required educated rulers. So Alexander and a small group of noble companions were sent to study. The location was peaceful, far removed from politics and from war. For a brief period, the future rulers of the Macedonian Empire lived not as soldiers, but as students. The subjects were extensive: philosophy, politics, ethics, medicine, science, geography, literature, history. Aristotle wanted his students to understand the world, not simply how to rule it. And Alexander absorbed everything. The hunger for knowledge appears again and again throughout the sources. He questioned constantly, observed constantly, collected information constantly. Years later, during his campaigns, he would ask about unfamiliar plants, strange animals, foreign customs, distant lands. The conqueror often looked suspiciously like a researcher, and that curiosity likely began with his time with Aristotle. Yet among Aristotle's lessons, one influence towered above all the rest: Homer, the Iliad, the story of Achilles. To understand Alexander, we need to understand Achilles, because Alexander never really escaped him. Achilles was everything a young prince could admire: the greatest warrior, the fastest fighter, the most feared hero in Greek mythology. But Achilles offered something even more attractive: glory. Not wealth, not comfort, not security, but immortality through memory. The promise that centuries after your death, people would still remember your name. For Alexander, that idea was irresistible. Ancient writers claim Aristotle prepared a special edition of the Iliad for him, a version Alexander supposedly carried throughout his campaigns. Whether every detail is true, as we've said before, ultimately doesn't matter, because the broader point still remains. The Iliad became more than a book, it became a blueprint. Alexander would compare himself to Achilles, measured himself to Achilles, dreamed of surpassing Achilles. And once someone begins competing with mythology, normal ambitions begin to feel very small. Yet Aristotle's influence extended beyond the stories. The philosopher exposed Alexander to ideas, big ideas, dangerous ideas, questions about leadership, justice, government, the nature of humanity. Questions that kings rarely asked. Most rulers inherit power. Few stop to examine it. Aristotle encouraged examination, he encouraged skepticism, and he encouraged curiosity. The irony in that is fascinating. Philosophers spend their whole lives searching for wisdom. Conquerors spend their whole lives pursuing power. Alexander would become both, or at least he would try to. In later centuries, people would sometimes describe him as a philosopher king, a ruler combining intellect and action, knowledge and strength. Whether he achieved that ideal remains still open to debate, but the ambition itself mattered. Because Aristotle helped convince Alexander that military greatness alone was insufficient. Victory was not enough. A truly great leader needed understanding, he needed culture, he needed vision. And perhaps that is why Alexander would later carry books into military campaigns, why he would sponsor scientific investigations, why he would surround himself with scholars as well as soldiers. The classroom left its mark. Yet only education can take a person so far. Eventually, every student must leave school. Every lesson must be tested. Every future king must enter the real world. And by the time Alexander reached his mid-teens, another question was beginning to emerge. Not whether he was intelligent, not whether he was educated, not whether he was ambitious, but whether he could actually lead. Because philosophy is one thing, command is another. And soon, Philip would give his son an opportunity to prove himself, an opportunity that would change everything. Alexander was but 16 years old, and for the first time in his life, a kingdom would be placed in his hands. Most people imagine they would recognize greatness if they saw it. A future conqueror, a future king, a future legend. Surely there'd be signs. Surely there'd be something obvious, something unmistakable. Yet, history rarely works that way. The young Alexander, he didn't look like a giant among men. He didn't tower over crowds. He didn't possess the intimidating physical presence people often associate with conquerors. In fact, going by many ancient descriptions, it's quite the opposite. Alexander was relatively short by modern standards. He was compact, athletic, but more built for movement than brute force. His greatest weapon was not his size, it was his energy. The sources describe someone constantly in motion, someone restless, driven, someone that was intense. The kind of person who enters a room and immediately changes its atmosphere. Not because of physical power, but because of personality. Ancient writers repeatedly struggle to describe him. Some focus on his charisma, others on his ambition, others on a strange magnetism that seemed to draw people toward him. Honestly, even centuries later, the descriptions feel less like historical observations and more like attempts to explain an experience. What was it about Alexander that made people follow him? Because follow him they did. Across deserts, mountains, continents, men followed Alexander into situations that seemed impossible, sometimes irrational or suicidal. That kind of loyalty cannot be explained by military success alone. Something else was happening, and perhaps the earliest hints appeared during his youth. The stories from this period paints a complicated picture. Alexander was intelligent. We all agree on that. He learned quickly, absorbed information rapidly, remembered details, and asked difficult questions. Yet intelligence was only part of the equation. He was also emotional. He was quick to anger. He was quick to react. He was quick to take offense. The same intensity that made him extraordinary could also make him dangerous. Many of the people closest to Alexander spent their lives trying to manage that intensity, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Because ambition has a dark side. The desire to achieve great things often comes paired with impatience. The belief that obstacles exist to overcome. The belief that limitations are temporary. The belief that ordinary rules apply to ordinary people. Alexander possessed all three. And as he grew older, those traits became increasingly obvious. One story tells of Alexander hearing about Philip's victories, campaign after campaign, city after city, success after success. Now, most sons would have felt pride at that. Oh, my father, look at this successful individual. Yet Alexander reportedly felt more frustration. Not because he disliked his father, quite the opposite, because Philip was conquering everything. And Alexander feared there'd be nothing left for him. Think about how extraordinary that mindset is. Most young nobles dream of inheriting wealth, power, security. Alexander, on the other hand, worried that there'd be no glory left to win, no achievements left to claim, no impossible challenges left to overcome. Whether this story happened exactly as described is impossible to know. But once again, it survives because it feels true. It matches everything else we know. The relentless drive, the refusal to think small, the obsession with accomplishment, the belief that an ordinary life was unacceptable. That belief would eventually carry him farther than anyone imagined. For now, however, it's still confined to his dreams, to ambitions, to possibilities, because despite all the stories, despite all the education and all the expectations, Alexander had not yet faced a true test. He had not commanded armies, he had not governed a kingdom, he had not stood responsible for the lives of others. This was all about to change. In 340 BC, Philip marched away from Macedonia. The king had campaigns to fight, territory to secure, enemies to defeat. And for the first time in his life, Alexander was left behind. Not as a student, not as an observer, not as a prince, but as a ruler. At 16 years old, the future conqueror was about to receive his first taste of power and his first opportunity to prove that he deserved it. There is a moment in every heir's life when preparation ends, when lessons now become responsibilities, when theory becomes reality. For Alexander, that moment arrived at 16. Most princes spent their youth observing power. Alexander was handed it. In 340 BC, Philip departed Macedonia, as I said, to continue his campaigns. He had enemies to fight, he had territory to secure, he ultimately had a kingdom that he wanted to expand. And for the first time in his son's life, he left the kingdom behind. Not in the hands of generals, not in the hands of advisors, in the hands of Alexander. The title was regent, acting ruler of Macedonia. It sounds ceremonial, almost symbolic, but it wasn't. The responsibility was real, the risks were real, and the consequences were very real. Every noble in Macedonia was watching, every rival family was watching, every neighboring tribe was watching. And somehow, beyond the frontier, enemies saw an opportunity. Because kingdoms ruled by teenagers rarely appear strong. They appear vulnerable. The Magi thought so. This tribe lived north of Macedonia, a people accustomed to testing borders and exploiting weaknesses. And when Philip marched away, they rebelled. To many rulers, this would have been a crisis. To Alexander, it became an opportunity. His first real command, first independent campaign, his first chance to prove he was more than just Philip's son. The young regent responded immediately, without hesitation or endless consultations and waiting for his father to return. He gathered troops, he marched north, and met the rebellion head-on. The details of the campaign are ultimately mostly lost. Ancient historians rarely preserve the small victories. They focus on the great ones. Yet, the outcome is clear. Alexander won. The Magi were defeated. The rebellion collapsed. Macedonian authority was restored. For most 16-year-olds, that achievement alone would have been remarkable. For Alexander, it was merely the beginning. Because after the victory came something unexpected, something that would become a pattern throughout his life. He founded a city. The settlement became known as Alexandropolis, the city of Alexander. It was not his most famous city, not by a long shot. Future Alexandrias would stretch from Egypt to Central Asia. Some would become centers of trade, others centers of learning, still others centers of imperial power. But this was the first city carrying his name, the first glimpse of a habit that would follow him across continents. Alexander did not simply conquer territory, he reshaped it. Even as a teenager, the instinct was already there. Victory should leave something behind, something permanent, something that endured after the soldiers had marched away. The campaign revealed something important. Alexander could command. He could make decisions. He could act independently. And perhaps most importantly, Alexander could succeed. The stories of destiny no longer mattered as much. The stories of omens mattered less. The stories of prophecy began to fade. Now there was evidence, real evidence, evidence that the prince could lead. And Philip noticed. The king had spent years preparing his son, years investing in his education, years shaping him into an heir. Now, for the first time, he could see the results. Yet while Alexander was proving himself in the north, Philip was preparing something much larger, something generations of Greeks had dreamed about, something that would consume the rest of Alexander's life. Persia, the greatest empire on earth, the wealthiest kingdom in the known world, the ancient rival of Greece, and Philip intended to invade it. For centuries, Greek leaders had spoken about revenge, spoken about unity, spoken about carrying the war eastward. Philip was the first ruler with a realistic chance of making it happen. His army was ready. His kingdom was powerful. His enemies were defeated. The dream was no longer a fantasy. It was becoming a plan. And as the young Alexander celebrated his first victory, events were already moving toward an even greater confrontation. Because not everyone welcomed Macedonian dominance. Not everyone accepted Philip's vision. And not everyone was willing to surrender Greek independence. In Athens, voices of resistance were growing louder. In Thebes, old loyalties remained strong. Across Greece, fear and resentment simmered beneath the surface. The age of the independent city-state was nearing its end. It simply hadn't realized it yet. And before Philip could march against Persia, he would have to settle one final score, much closer to home. The road to Asia would first pass through Greece, and on that road waited a battlefield named Chaeronea. For centuries, the Greeks had looked east, towards Persia, the greatest empire the world had ever seen, a kingdom stretching from Egypt to India, a realm so vast that entire nations disappeared inside its borders. Persia was wealth beyond imagination, power beyond comparison. And for the generations, it had been the enemy. Greek memory is long. Long enough to remember Marathon, long enough to remember Thermopylae, long enough to remember the Persian invasions. Stories of Persian armies crossing into Greece had become part of Greek identity itself. The victories were celebrated, the defeats remembered. The resentment never fully disappeared. Many Greek politicians spoke about revenge. Many dreamed about carrying the war eastward. Very few possessed the power to attempt it. Philip did. By the late 330 BC, the Macedonian king had accomplished something remarkable. Not merely military victories or merely territorial expansion, something far more difficult. He had unified Greece, or at least unified enough of it. The old rivalry still existed. Athens still remembered its glory. Thebes still remembered its power. Sparta still remembered everything. But for the first time in centuries, a single leader stood above the Greek world. Philip. The achievement was extraordinary, yet Philip viewed it as a beginning, not an ending, because the king's ultimate goal lay elsewhere. Asia, the Persian Empire, the greatest military expedition Greece had ever attempted. And unlike earlier dreamers, Philip had a plan, a real plan. His army had been reformed, his generals were experienced, his economy was stronger than ever. Everything was falling into place. The invasion would not be presented as a Macedonian conquest. No. It'd be presented as something larger, something every Greek could support. A pan-Hellenic crusade, a united Greek campaign against the ancient enemy. The language was politically brilliant. Philip wasn't asking Greeks to submit to Macedonia. He was asking them to join history, to join a war generations had imagined, and many accepted. Not because they loved Philip, many didn't. Not because they trusted Macedonia, many didn't. But because Persia represented an opportunity, wealth, glory, land, adventure. The sort of opportunities that convince people to overlook old grudges, at least temporarily. Yet not everyone was convinced. In Athens, opposition continued growing, and a center of that opposition was one man, Demosthenes, one of the greatest orators in Greek history, a politician whose speeches would survive for more than 2,000 years, a man who viewed Philip very differently than Philip viewed himself. To Philip, he was uniting Greece. To Demosthenes, he was conquering it. To Philip, Macedonia represented progress. To Demosthenes, Macedonia represented domination. Again and again he warned Athens. Again and again he urged resistance. Again and again he argued that Philip's ambitions threatened Greek freedom. History often remembers Demosthenes as a loser. That's not necessarily the fairest assessment, because from his perspective, the threat was very real. Philip was absorbing power at an astonishing rate. Cities fell under his influence, alliances shifted, independent states became dependent ones. Demosthenes simply saw the danger before many others did. The problem was that seeing danger and stopping it are two very different things. Philip continued advancing, and with every success, resistance became more desperate. Eventually, Athens found common cause with another city, a city that had once dominated Greece, a city that had once shattered Spartan power, a city that understood exactly what Macedonian victory would mean: Thebes. The alliance was remarkable. Athens and Thebes had spent generations competing with one another, distrusting one another, sometimes fighting one another. Now they stood together, not because they loved each other, but because they feared Philip more. And when former rivals unite against you, it usually means something important is about to happen. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, as the saying goes. Across Greece, armies began moving. Spears were gathered, supplies prepared, allies summoned. The final confrontation was approaching. For Philip, the battle would determine whether his life's work survived. For Athens and Thebes, the battle would determine whether Greek independence survived. And for Alexander, the battle would become something else entirely: a test. The first truly great test of his life. Because until now, Alexander had shown promise. He had shown intelligence, education, leadership, courage. But promise is not proof. Soon, on a battlefield called Charonea, he would receive an opportunity few now 18-year-olds would ever receive. The chance to help decide the fate of Greece. The chance to stand beside his father in one of history's decisive battles. The chance to prove that all stories told about him were true. And before the day was over, the prince would become a warrior. The warrior would become a legend, and Greece would never be the same again. To set the scene, it's the late 330s BC, 338 BC to be specific. The armies gathered, not merely as soldiers, not merely as citizens, but as representatives of two different futures. One future belonged to Macedonia, a centralized kingdom, a professional army, a new political order built around Philip's vision. The other belonged to the old Greece, the Greece of independent city-states, the Greece of local autonomy, the Greece that had produced Athens, Sparta, and Thebes. For centuries, these city-states had dominated the Greek world. Now, they faced the very real possibility of becoming subjects rather than leaders. And so they made a choice. They would fight. Athens and Thebes formed the core of the alliance. Other states joined them, some enthusiastically, others more reluctantly. See, not everyone believed victory was possible, but many believed resistance was necessary. Because there are moments in history when people fight not because they expect to win, but because they refuse to surrender. The coalition army marched to meet Philip. Among its ranks stood some of the finest soldiers in Greece, veterans, professionals, men raised in traditions older than Macedonia itself. Yet one unit stood above all the others, the Sacred Band of Thebes. 300 elite warriors, perhaps the most famous military formation in Greece. For generations, their reputation had bordered on legend. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were professionals, men who trained constantly, men whose entire lives revolved around warfare, men who had helped make Thebes the dominant military power of Greece. Stories surrounded them, admiration surrounded them, fear surrounded them. To many Greeks, the Sacred Band represented the very best your civilization could produce. And if Macedonia intended to dominate Greece, eventually it would have to defeat them. Meanwhile, on the other side, Philip's army approached. This was not Macedonia of previous generations, not the fragmented kingdom Philip inherited, not the kingdom mocked by southern Greeks. This was a military machine, the product of decades of reform, years of campaigning, countless victories. Veterans filled the ranks, commanders understood their roles, the phalanx moved with frightening discipline, and somewhere among them rode Alexander, 18 years old enough to fight, young enough that some opponents still viewed him as a child, but no longer untested. The rebellion against Mede had proved he could command. Years of education had sharpened his mind. A lifetime spent observing Philip had taught him how great leaders behaved. Now came the final examination. Because battle reveals things no classroom can. Battle reveals courage. It reveals weakness. It reveals character. It strips away titles. It removes excuses, ignores potential. On a battlefield, only results matter. And soon, near a small town called Chaeronea, both sides prepared for war. Thousands of men formed ranks, spears lowered, shields locked, order shouted. The future of Greece stood waiting. For the soldiers assembled there, the stakes could not have been any higher. If Philip won, Macedonia would dominate Greece. If the coalition won, Philip's life work might collapse overnight. Everything rested upon the coming battle. Everything. And when dawn arrived, one age would end and another would begin. The Battle of Chaeronea began like many ancient battles. Two armies facing one another across open ground. Thousands of men waiting. Thousands of men afraid. Thousands of men pretending they weren't. From a distance, ancient warfare can appear quite orderly. You have your neat lines, your perfect formations, your heroic paintings, yet reality is different. Dust, noise, confusion, fear, the constant awareness that a single mistake could mean death. Philip commanded the Macedonian right. Alexander stood on the left, accompanied by experienced officers, men who had spent their lives fighting wars, men whose job was partly to help the young prince survive. Because despite everything Alexander had accomplished, he was still 18 years old. The battle began. Ancient accounts disagree about many details about this battle. Historians still debate movements, timings, but one moment still stands out. Philip started to pull back, slowly, deliberately. To the Athenians, it looked like retreat, weakness, perhaps even panic. They advanced. The lines stretched, formations loosened, momentum carried them forward, exactly as Philip intended. The Macedonian king had spent decades studying warfare. He understood something many commanders forget. Sometimes victory comes not from strength, but from patience. The Athenians continued pressing forward, and gradually, without realizing it, they began to create openings. Openings Philip had been waiting for. Then Macedonia struck. Across the battlefield, formations collided. The fighting intensified. Chaos spread. And on the Macedonian left, Alexander advanced. This was the moment. Every lesson, every expectation, every sacrifice, every story, all of it led here. The young prince drove forward, toward the strongest section of the enemy line, toward the Thebans, toward the sacred band themselves. Now the details remain uncertain, but the outcome does not. The coalition line broke. The Macedonians surged through. The battle turned, then it ended. The sacred band fought to the bitter end. Ancient sources describe them standing their ground rather than retreating, rather than surrendering, rather than running. They died where they stood. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover their burial site, a mass grave, a monument, a stone lion watching silently over the dead. Even today, it remains one of the most powerful reminders of the ancient world. Because Chaeronea was not merely a Macedonian victory, it was the end of an era. The age of independent Greek city-states was over. Athens survived, Thebes survived, many cities survived, but none would ever again dominate Greece the way they once had. The future belonged to Macedonia. And standing at the center of that future was Alexander. The prince had entered the battle as an heir. He left it as something else. A proven commander, a warrior, a man whose name was beginning to spread beyond Macedonia. Yet for all the glory of Chaeronea, the greatest challenges still lay ahead. Philip's dream of Persia was finally within reach. The army was ready, the kingdom was united, the future seemed secure. For the first time in decades, everything was falling into place. And that is often when history becomes most dangerous. Because while Philip was preparing to conquer an empire, fate was preparing something else. A wedding, a murder, a crown. And a 20-year-old king would soon inherit the world. Next time, we will begin to understand how the prince became a king. Thanks for listening. This has been A Slice of History.